It has been 12 years since Canon upended the video and film industry with the launch of the 5D Mark II, the first full-frame camera to record HD video. In the last decade, Canon went from dominating the DSLR video market to being overshadowed by Sony's innovation. If there are any cameras set to dethrone Sony and perhaps create a second revolution, it is the highly anticipated R5 and R6. The R5 is an absolute monster. 45 megapixel sensor and 8K internal raw video up to 30p. The R6 is a slightly more reserved little brother for users who don't require heavy artillery, still offering much of the same features as the R5 with reduced resolution and no raw recording. Canon gave us a few hours to test both of these cameras out, so we met up with my talented friend Nick at a skate park in Toronto to put some action in front of these cameras.
I'm always a little nervous when we only get a few hours to do camera reviews, and in this case we have two to do at the same time, but I think we're going to get a really great glimpse of the power and performance of these two cameras.
Like all of my reviews, I'm looking primarily at two things. One is image quality. I'm looking at detail and dynamic range improvements over competitive or previous products. I'm also looking at usability. Now this is a big one. How intuitive is the design, and how well do the standout features perform?
The big news with the R5 is its 8K 12-bit raw video, a first for hybrid cameras, and the R6 super samples a 5K sensor into 4K. Super sharp image is what we're likely going to see. But these are very powerful still cameras, so we're going to start there.
Canon has redesigned the CMOS sensor and carried over the Digic X processor from the 1DX Mark III, and improved the RF mount for better lens communication. This creates a holy trinity of staggering performance improvements. Here is a portrait with the two cameras, and the 5D Mark IV for reference. Right off the top, Canon asserts that the 45 megapixel sensor on the R5 outperforms their very own 50 megapixel 5DS thanks to the technology boost. Another long-awaited feature is Canon's first jump into in-body image stabilization, or IBIS, giving users an astounding 8 stops of image stability, better than any camera currently on the market. To test this with photography, I tried to see how low I could drop the shutter speed using an ND filter. Now it was so bright out that I actually had to stack ND filters, and so there's going to be a little bit of weird vignetting. Two advantages of Canon's IBIS are the large diameter lens mount and the RF mount's high-speed communication. The large diameter mount means the sensor can travel further without vignetting. When using an RF lens with IS, there is an added benefit of coordinated control IS, which enables yaw and pitch correction to be performed in sync by both the in-lens and the sensor, resulting in a higher degree of stabilization, all made possible by the RF mount's high-speed communication. Autofocus takes another leap with this camera. What absolutely blew me away about the 1DX Mark III is the new head detect autofocus. With this feature, your subject no longer needs to be looking at the camera. They can wear helmets, glasses, whatever, and it just locks on. It's not glitchy or a novelty. It really works, and works very well. What I did discover, however, is it does require the subject to be a certain size within the frame or a certain distance from the camera, and I think that's perfectly acceptable. Now let's talk continuous shooting. These cameras are nearly as powerful as the 1DX Mark III. They share the same burst rate in an electronic shutter. In mechanical, they'll do 12 frames per second while performing full autofocus and auto exposure. The R5 delivers 350 JPEGs or 180 45 megapixel raw images at 12 frames per second, while the smaller resolution of the R6 cranks those numbers up to 1000 JPEGs, 240 RAW, or 1000 in the new 10-bit HEIF format using UHS-2 SD cards. Now we're going to move to video. The big news here, of course, is the resolution, which is truly exciting. In my experience, Canon has always suffered a bit at 4K, lacking image detail compared with the other brands. We know this is greatly improved with these two cameras, but by how much? We tested both of these against the 5D Mark IV for reference. And this is where I encountered my first issue. I fully expected the R5 and 6 to blow the 5D out of the water. But you can see that while the R5 is sharp, and surprisingly so is the 5D, albeit a bit artificially, the R6 is not resolving like it should. Now I'm going to chalk that up to the fact that we had to shoot a lot in 3 hours and I couldn't check footage, along with these cameras being pre-production versions. We also shot out in 30+ degree heat for 3 hours and the R5 overheated halfway through, so I didn't get a chance to shoot any true 8K to test against. In the R5, we use the 4K HQ mode, which super samples the 8K. Now this feature gives you footage that your edit suite can use while deriving some benefit from the 8K sensor. When it comes to dynamic range offered in video, Canon has finally joined the HDR game. Now, you're going to say the 5D Mark IV had an HDR setting, but that wasn't real HDR. The new HDR PQ setting gives users a baked-in 10-bit HDR image that conforms to Rec 2020 color gamut. For Canon log users, we also get a 10-bit 422 internal on the R5 and the R6. High frame rates have finally been unleashed in these cameras, and by that I mean there is no longer any crop at any speed in any resolution. The R5 does 4K 120, while the R6 does up to 120 in HD. Coming back to IBIS, but this time for video, we're going to look at all the ways that this new IBIS can help the video producer. It's nice to be able to leave a fluid head at home or not have to rig up a gimbal if you really don't have to. First, let's examine what these cameras are like handheld. Now we're going to add the digital stabilization that claims to help with the camera operator's stride. And finally, comparing the IBIS to a gimbal. All in all, I absolutely love the new camera design on the R5 and the R6. Now the R5, of course, is my favorite. And at risk of sounding a little smug, there were a few people online who took me to town over my distaste for the touch bar on the EOS R. And I said it didn't really make a lot of sense, it was really difficult to use, and it would have just been better if they had a multi-controller button. Well, they listened to their pros, and I wasn't the only one who felt this way. Look at here, we've now got a multi-controller button. They've also done away with the D-pad that you find on the EOS R as well, which is sort of just an up and down thing, replacing it with the sort of the multi-wheel that you find on their DSLRs, which is so much better and so much easier to use. So every improvement that can be made in a Canon camera, they've made on this. I actually can't find any fault with it. There's nothing on here that I thought was confusing or weird, and this is only with a couple hours with the camera, so kudos to Canon for that. I just noticed that I had a pen in my ear. Hey, thanks for letting me know that I had a pen in my ear. I'll put it in that one now. Another favorite of mine is the control ring on the new RF lenses. For example, I love the ability to change Kelvin on the fly. It's potentially great for dock video work going from inside to outside. One note is that this esoteric feature won't work in camera while the camera is actually recording. We did discover that it worked, however, if you send the signal out to an external recorder. Now, speaking of RF glass, this is a great time to remind viewers of the power of the RF mount. And this means a wider image circle and a shorter flange distance, and that translates into edge-to-edge sharpness, even wide open, unlike you've ever seen before. Unprecedented, really. Now, if you have EF glass and you're not so willing to part with it yet, and it's modern EF glass, then you're gonna get all the benefits of this camera in terms of what the camera does. Stability, autofocus, continuous shooting. None of that changes with EF glass, just with a converter. So a super useful camera with modern or slightly older glass. A final note on odds and ends. They've now added a USB-C port which can now charge and power the camera, a very long-awaited feature. The HDMI goes from mini to micro, which should see a small boost in durability as well, although that depends on who you ask. And finally, the LPE6NH batteries are new, giving 14% more life beyond the LPE6N. The cameras are also still back compatible with all Canon LPE6 batteries, if you have a million of them laying around, as I do. The past few years have had many Canon fans scratching their heads at the company's public lack of innovation. But it was clear that behind the scenes they were working away at something they knew could catapult them back to the top. While the EOS R underwhelmed me, the R5 especially has given me the opposite impression. This is quite possibly the most impressive, most powerful, most elegant mirrorless camera I have ever used. Without question, I am very happy to see Canon over-deliver on the anticipation.